Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and I'm very gratified, as always, that you chose to spend some of your day today listening to me talk about military history. It's been extremely hot and humid where I live for the past few days, but a big storm just passed over and cooled it off real nice, so I'm able to go out on the porch today and work on this for you. Mosquitoes here are usually out in force by this time, but there seem to be very few this year, so maybe they're being responsible and practicing social distancing. Whatever the reason is, I'm grateful, since it's usually impossible to be outside here this time of year, even if you douse yourself in protective chemicals. Today we're going to continue with our series on the Rif War that raged in the Spanish protectorate of Morocco during the 1920s. I'm using the same three sources for this one that I have been in the previous episodes of this series, namely The Betrothed of Death by Jose Alvarez, Rebels in the Rif by David Woolman, and Primo de Rivera and Ab-del Krim by Shannon Fleming. I'll begin with a short recap of where we left off at the end of the last episode, and then get on with the story. In 1920, when the period with which we are dealing opens, Spain was in the process of occupying the small strip of Moroccan territory in the region of historic presidios, or enclaves, on the coast of Africa opposite of Gibraltar. The two coastal towns of Ceuta and Melilla had been in Spanish hands since the days of Columbus, but little expansion in their control over the surrounding territory had taken place in the intervening 4 centuries. With the loss of the overseas empire in the latter half of the 1800s, the Moroccan territory, which was the last significant possession left to the Spanish after the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in the war with the United States in 1898, assumed a prominent place in their military policy. Increasing their control here would compensate somewhat psychologically for the sense of national humiliation caused by the disasters of the 19th century. More practically, the territory was the only place left where an ambitious Spanish soldier could expect to find combat, and with it, rapid promotion. In 1912, Spanish Morocco would be made into a formal protectorate as a result of a conclusion of a treaty with France and her puppet, the Moroccan Sultan. The territory was divided administratively into 2 military commands, or commandancias, one in the west and one in the east. The western commandancia was centered on the Presidio of Ceuta and included the capital of Spanish Africa, the town of Tetuan. This district included the regions known as the Jabal and the Gamara, as well as the Lucas region further west. The eastern commandancia was centered on Melilla, and included the rocky highlands of the Rif as well as the Kurt River Valley. Generally, a commander of the rank of general led each commandancia, with a high commissioner appointed by the king in charge of the protectorate as a whole. The high commissioner was not necessarily a military man, but usually was and had been up to this time. Spain faced 2 enemies to her rule in the protectorate, one in each commandancia. In the west was El Raizuli, a larger-than-life figure, a combination bandit chief / holy man / Robin Hood figure of the kind that frequently could be found exercising local influence in this region. This man's influence stemmed from charisma, daring, and a fortune gathered by audacious criminal exploits, including numerous kidnappings of prominent wealthy individuals for ransom. One such audacious move nearly involved Theodore Roosevelt's U.S. Marines in a Moroccan war, when a wealthy Greek businessman, Ion Perdicaris, who had a dodgy claim on U.S. citizenship, was snatched from his estate at Tangier. The unhappy Sultan, powerless to force Raizuli to release the man or to resist American pressure, was forced to pay the ransom himself. Deeds such as these won Raizuli immense prestige among the inhabitants of the western regions, especially in the Jabala, where he established himself in a stronghold in the mountains of Tazarat. Raizuli, or as he was often known, the Eagle of Jannat, after the nearby village of his birth, was effectively independent of the Sultan and of the Spanish in the area of his influence, played the two off of one another to his advantage with great skill. The appearance of dealing with the Europeans in Morocco on equal terms, and of coming away the winner in the process, made Raizuli a legend in the land. He was said to be protected by otherworldly powers, and it was common knowledge that only a golden pistol ball forged in the holy city of Mecca could do him harm. In the eastern commandancia, the threat was less concrete, so to speak, but more serious. Various tribes of the Rif and the rest of the regions to the east were the most warlike of the entirety of Morocco, including the much larger French zone. Like in the rest of Spanish Morocco, the inhabitants here were in theory subjects of the Sultan, but this was purely formal, as the Sultan had no real power here. Riffians were tough and skilled fighters, organized along tribal lines. Here the term tribe is used to mean an assemblage of clans, which were themselves an assemblage of allied family groups. These tribes controlled well-defined territories and governed themselves by a system of alliance known as the Lif. This alliance system, in which social pressure acted to very reliably secure alliances for groups in serious danger of outright conquest, acted to preserve a balance of power among the tribes of the region. Within the tribal organization, the same lift system was replicated, with alliances at the clan and family level. This mechanism acted to keep a more or less stable order in the violent conditions of northern Morocco, where no strong central police authority usually existed. This system obtained throughout Spanish Morocco and beyond, but was found in its purest form in the Rif, whose independent mountaineers, bred to arms and trained by a lifetime of feuding and vendetta, acknowledged no master. The strongest of the Riffian tribes were the Beni Uruguay, who controlled the territory along the Mediterranean shores of Alhucemas Bay, consisting of a small coastal plain in the mountains inland. This territory was near the center of the Spanish protectorate. Other Riffian tribes controlled the regions eastward to Melilla and southwards through the Kurt River Valley to the frontier of the French zone. They were a source of persistent but minor trouble to the Spanish throughout the decades leading up to 1921. Occasionally, a particularly skilled leader would arise among them and rally some portion of the tribes in common cause against either other Moroccans, the Europeans, or both. These disturbances were usually short-lived and fell apart after the first reverse or after the death of the leader. In more recent years, the European, and principally Spanish and German presence in their mountains had noticeably increased following the discovery of rich mineral deposits in the mountains. The last major outbreak of violence in the Rif, and the one that set the stage for the coming conflict, was the result of the discovery of this vast subterranean wealth. A pretender to the Moroccan throne, known as Bou Hamara or sometimes El Rogui, rallied a considerable portion of the population of eastern Morocco to his standard and made himself effectively independent in a region that included parts of the Spanish and French protectorates. Sultan's forces were sent to put him down, and they were defeated, and the pretender was established as a de facto overlord over most of the Spanish Rif. His mistake came when, in order to raise funds, he invited European mining companies to bid for concessions to develop the ores of the area. When the Riffian tribes realized that El Rogui had sold their land to foreigners, they united against him and defeated his men in battle, sending the unhappy pretender a captive to the Sultan, who had him tortured to death. After this, the victorious Riffians turned on the foreigners in their mountains and attacked Spanish labor parties building mines and railroads in the Rif. These clashes resulted in the dispatch of Spanish troops to the Melilla sector, and bloody battles were fought in which the Riffians were eventually subdued. The long list of Spanish casualties, many of whom were young draftees forced to fight in a colony to which most of the Spanish were indifferent, aroused massive discontent in Spain, resulting in protests and demonstrations against conscription that were savagely repressed by the authorities. These disturbances and their repression are remembered in Spanish history as the Tragic Week. Despite the protests and the occasional setbacks in the colony, the Spanish effort continued. By 1920, the situation was greatly improved, and large portions of the country were under effective Spanish control. In the east, the Spanish under the swaggering General Silvestre were pressing westwards from Melilla and establishing a system of fortified posts throughout the Rif designed to keep the wild and empty country under control. As 1921 began, a major drive was underway in the west in Comandancia under High Commissioner Damaso Berenguer, designed to isolate the wily Razuli in his fortress at Tazarut and finally eliminate him as a power in the Jabal and the Gamara. This effort was led by two crack corps of the Spanish colonial army. The older component, known as the Regulares, were Moroccan soldiers recruited to the Spanish service from amongst the tribesmen of the region. Unsurprisingly, these men shared many of the martial qualities of their kinsmen on the other side of the line, and were tough, reliable soldiers, capable of great endurance and tenacity. They were joined by a newly created formation, taking part in the attack on Raizuli's domain as their first major campaign. This was the Tercio de Extranjeros, or the Spanish Foreign Legion, a regiment-sized force of dedicated professional soldiers raised to replace the unsatisfactory conscript infantry in offensive operations in the Protectorate. In their first clashes, these men had established a reputation for relentless aggression that would be confirmed over and over again in the years to come. By July 22, 1921, these forces had pushed back Raizuli's men, surrounded him in his mountain stronghold, and were preparing to launch the final assault. However, Raizuli's supernatural protector would apparently come to his aid again at this time. On this very day, the Spanish commander received word that his counterpart in the east, Silvestre, had been routed out of the Spanish fort Anwal and his entire army dispersed or destroyed. Worse still, the defeat had caused the collapse of the entire Spanish defensive system in the east, and the tribes of the Riffians were everywhere rallying to the standard of a new and very powerful leader, Mohammed Ab-del Krim. This man, along with his younger brother Mahmud, had welded together an alliance of the strongest of the Riffian tribes, and aspired not to mere rebellion, but to outright independence, the expulsion of the Spanish and French, and the establishment of a Republic of the Rif as an equal in the family of nations. This momentous nationalist movement, first of its kind in the region, grew up under the nose of the unheeding Spanish and seemed to have burst fully formed into being as soon as their troops crossed the Amarcran River, a point at which the Riffians had determined to fight. Here, not far from where the plains west of Melilla rise up into the mountains of the Rif, they showed their strength and achieved strategic surprise over the overextended Spanish, whose manpower was dispersed in hundreds of small positions. The resulting defeat was a total shock to the Spaniards. Tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers and civilians were massacred. Among the dead was the Spanish commander Silvestre, who was said to have taken his own life with his sidearm as his troops broke in panic and fled around him. The Spanish people were just as shocked as the army, and the government fell amid a storm of outrage and mutual condemnations. High Commissioner Berenguer, leading the effort in the west, met the emergency with dispatch, however. As we have seen, the assault on Tazaret was called off, many of the Spanish troops making ready to carry out the final assault, including 2 banderas, or battalions, of the newly formed legion, rushed to Ceuta to board ship for Melilla, where the ancient Spanish enclave itself was in danger. Little more than 2 days after the disaster, the grimy, unshaven men of the legion disembarked to frantic applause of the terrified citizens of Melilla, and along with elements of the regulares, established a defensive perimeter around the city. Regular Spanish troops poured into the town from the western commandancia and from Spain itself. Luckily for the Spanish, the Riffians did not follow up their success with a strong drive on the city, and no major attack materialized. Within a few weeks, the Spanish were getting ready to go over on the offensive and to retake their lost territory. Spanish would not remain on the defensive for long. The legion units in the Melilla region were, for the time being, under the command of Franco, who was normally the chief of the 1st Bandera, as Milan Estrella, the founder of the legion and its usual commander, was currently back in Spain organizing a renewed recruitment drive for the expansion of the Tercio. Franco would command the legion in the field more often than not in these first major campaigns. It was under his command that the unit really established its reputation for relentless aggression and a conquer-or-die mentality in the attack. Legion's preferred method of assaulting enemy positions was a furious bayonet charge, in which the riflemen would rout out the defenders in a hand-to-hand struggle with cold steel in the sidearm, heavy use of hand grenades. This extremely brutal method of attack was an outgrowth of the particular indoctrination received by the legionaries, which glorified indifference to wounds and death and the active seeking of these as a means of valorous redemption. Franco, who was often in the thick of this fighting, was the ideal leader of men of this kind. Usually described as having a bland, genial expression, he always seems to be smiling in his pictures, and throughout his rise to power, he seems to have achieved his domination over others frictionlessly, exercising his influence more by charm than fear. As a cultivated persona, this was extremely effective in advancing Franco up the ranks of the Spanish ladder. So often, at critical points in Franco's rise to power, it would just so happen that he would be the right man at the right time. To describe Franco's style of leadership in the field, students of World War II might think of the American General Patton, but much more comradely and likable. Like Patton, Franco knew how to portray himself as a larger-than-life figure. Franco understood that the Spanish fighting man, and the Riffian for that matter, respected physical courage, and would often appear on the battlefield, exposing himself to the view of all on a white horse. This blended well with his quiet, smiling demeanor, giving the impression of effortless, totally natural bravery. That he did things like this and remained unwounded also gave him the aura of a charmed man, or of a man of destiny. To others, such as General Silvestre, leader with a much more conventionally macho persona, habits such as these were nothing more than a dangerous affectation and an unwarranted risk to the horses. To continue the comparison with Patton, while Patton was an abrasive man and made many enemies, he does not seem to have been really brutal or cruelly bloodthirsty. Franco, on the other hand, was an extraordinarily savage and calculating man underneath the smiling facade. The aggressive ethos of the Legion had a very dark side, like many of these warrior ideologies that glorify contempt of suffering and death. This dark side manifested itself in cruel and brutal actions towards their enemies, not only in combat but against incapacitated or captured enemy fighters as well as non-combatants. Martial codes like the Legion's treated those who were unable to defend themselves as weak and worthy of contempt. Massacres and mistreatment of prisoners and non-combatants became commonplace in the activities of the Legion. Franco, the smiling and retiring young man, had little conscience when it came to ordering these actions. It was the combination of these two sides of Franco's character that gave him such facility in exploiting the disintegrating Spanish political situation in the years to come so deftly in his pursuit of sole power. The bland and non-committal exterior allowed the blame for his crimes to fall on others. It is perhaps this that explains the success of his dictatorship, by far the longest-lasting and most durable of the interwar totalitarians, outlasting even Stalin by a good 2 decades. The Moroccans that the Spanish were fighting followed a traditional warrior culture that was very similar in this respect, and mistreatment and torture of Spanish prisoners were typical of the Riffians and the men fighting for Riffian. This made the conflict of the Protectorate an extremely inhumane contest in which massacres of civilians and brutal treatment of prisoners would become commonplace, limited practically only by the relatively low concentrations of non-combatants in most of his territory. Later on, when the legionaries and the Moroccans would fight side by side as the core of Franco's army in the Civil War, this brutality would be turned on the Spaniards themselves. A reputation for indiscriminate, berserker-like aggression was consciously cultivated by Franco to add the terror of their name to the weapons of the Legion. As soon as the perimeter around Melilla was made secure, on the 15th of August, Franco began this campaign of intimidation when he led an attack on the village of Sidi Amaran. This place lay on the Hidun Road and was guarded by a small war party. The legionaries quickly routed these men, in a short action that left 1 legionary dead and 8 wounded. Riffians in the area reacted and launched an immediate counterattack, which the Spanish beat off. After the village was secure, Franco embarked on a punitive campaign, slaughtering the villagers and burning their homes and crops, marching on the villages in the immediate area and giving them the same treatment before withdrawing back behind the Spanish lines. The rest of the month of August was spent in routine duties, escorting supply convoys to the strong points of the Melilla defense system. This defensive system was further strengthened on the 31st, when the Spanish retook the blockade of Mezquita. 2 banderas in the east, the 1st and 2nd, would resume the offensive in a limited way in September. As we have noted in the last part of the series, the city of Melilla was overlooked by the heights of Mount Gurugou, just a few kilometers away. Riffian artillery situated here could shell the town. The first step in retaking Gurugou and ending this menace was taken on the 8th. It eventuated in the largest battle yet fought by the Tercio in the Melilla area. In company with the regulares de Ceuta, the 2 banderas marched on Casabona, Spanish position at the base of Mount Gurugou. Their mission was to resupply this post and then establish another further on. They were met with serious resistance to their advance, which was overcome by a combined assault in which the regulares launched a frontal attack, while the Tercio swung around the engaged enemy and then hit them from the rear. Legionaries broke into the rebel position and drove the defenders out with the bayonet, then put it into a state of defense and beat off a counterattack. The mission of the column was accomplished, and the cost of the Tercio was typically heavy, with 22 men killed and another 68 wounded. The regulares suffered heavily as well, with another 100 casualties. The heavy toll in killed and wounded suffered in this relatively small-scale action would be typical of the violent battles fought in this war, in which the fighting saw no quarter given on either side, and intense action at point-blank range. Another notable action fought in this month by the Tercio was unusual, in that it saw the legionaries fighting in an exclusively defensive role. These battles took place on the 14th and 15th of September. The Legion had been assigned responsibility for the defense of one of the blockades of the defensive network. These blockades were small fortifications, often little more than large pillboxes built of sandbags, that made up the majority of the Spanish positions in the region. These were often poorly sited and had little storage capacity, meaning they required constant resupply to survive. Many of these were little more than death traps, and they were usually manned by regular conscript infantry, who generally hated them. This one was at Dar Hamed, and had a particularly evil reputation, acquiring the nickname El Malo, or the Bad One. Previous to this time, duty in this exposed position had been extremely unpopular, and had been assigned as a punishment to men assigned to a disciplinary battalion. A force of 15 legionaries fought their way into El Malo on the night of the 14th, and held off repeated counterattacks the next day with the rifle and grenade. A stalemate ensued in which both sides waited for the other to make the next move. Eventually, the Riffians settled the matter by bringing up artillery and firing point-blank into the blockade, totally demolishing it and killing all of the defenders. The deaths of these men in this obstinate defense became another part of the growing heroic mythology of the Legion. By the 17th, the Spanish strength in the area had increased to the point where Berenguer was ready to go over the offensive in earnest. The initial objectives would be to retake the fort at Nador, in the hills nearby, and the heights of Monte Argos. The first of these, Nador, lay about 10 miles south of Melilla on the coast of the Mar Chica. A column was assembled for this advance under the overall command of General Jose Cavalcante. The vanguard of this column was made up of the Tercio and the Regulares. The commanders of this vanguard as a whole, and of the elements of the Tercio and Regulares involved, were Jose Sanjurjo, Milan Estrella, and Emilio Mola, respectively. These three men would later go on to be some of the most prominent figures in the army conspiracy against the Second Republic in 1936. As this advance would take place in the vicinity of the coast, the Spanish fleet would lend its support, signing the battleships Alfonso XIII and España, as well as floating batteries of artillery, a squadron of aircraft, and an observation balloon. The advance began at 0700 hours on the 17th, departing from Sidi Hamed. Vanguard soon ran into heavy opposition. Early on, Milan Estrella was hit in the chest, incapacitating him and making his evacuation necessary. With Franco in charge, Tercio pushed the Riffians away from the approaches to Nador at the point of the bayonet. When they entered the lost position, which had been taken by the rebels more than a month before, they found the ground strewn with mutilated corpses of Spaniards still unburied. Accounts of grisly discoveries of this nature are common in descriptions of the Spanish re-entry into the towns and positions lost in the aftermath of the Anwal debacle. On the 23rd, the column moved on, operating against Tayuma, the site of a Spanish airfield overrun by the Riffians. Tercio attacked the wrecked field in company with a regiment of regular cavalry, the Regimiento de Caballera de Alcantara, taking it in a sharp battle. So far, the operation had been relatively bloodless for the Legion, who had lost only 2 killed and 40 wounded since leaving Sidi Hamed on the 17th. While these battles were taking place, the second wave of legionary recruits, many of whom came from the Americas, began to arrive in Morocco. 300 came aboard the steamer Antonio Lopez. 60 of these were from the U.S., the remainder coming from Canada, Mexico, and Cuba. A total of 1,350 Cubans joined the Tercio at this time. Half of these would arrive aboard the battleship Alfonso XIII at the end of the month, and the rest following not long after. These included the so-called Cuban Legion, a unit of Spaniards, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans organized by Captain Santiago Espino Rodriguez. However, these men learned that they would not be permitted to fight under this leader as their own distinct unit, but were instead expected to integrate themselves into the existing banderas of the Tercio. Many of them returned home. On the 1st of October, 1st and 2nd banderas were operating from Nador, the 3rd bandera was still in the Western Commandancia at Dar Aqaba, and the newly raised 4th bandera was assembling a training facility at Dar Riffian. This new bandera was not composed of new men, but was drawn from the existing banderas and the depot companies of the Tercio. The new recruits were instead integrated into existing units as replacements. In this way, the new bandera was not composed of men who were much less experienced than the others, and the combat quality of the 4 banderas could be kept as consistent as possible. This approach would be used every time the Tercio was expanded. At the same time, each bandera was expanded by the inclusion of a 3rd rifle company. Thus, when the 4th bandera built up to full strength, the Tercio would expand from 6 rifle and 3 machine gun companies to 12 rifle and 4 machine gun companies in total. The new month began with the Tercio back in action on the 2nd. This time they moved out from Nador to attack the southeastern heights of Mount Guragu, clearing the Riffians out of the positions of Sept and Ulad Dao. 3 days later they were storming Alatia. Supported by artillery, the men of the Tercio scared the cliffs protecting the defensive works here and compelled the defenders to abandon them. Legionaries reached the summit of the mountain as a result of this victory. The drive to rid the heights of Guragu from the enemy continued on the 8th, when the 2nd bandera occupied Sagangan in the iron mining area of San Juan de las Minas. When these preliminary assaults were out of the way, the units of the Tercio in the east would spearhead a main attack on the remaining rebels in the mountains overlooking Melilla. The Legion led 2 columns into this attack. The Riffians fought tenaciously to hold on to these important positions, but their defense finally crumbled under the attacks of the Tercio supported by gunfire from the sea, as well as from regiments of regular army artillery drawn from Galicia. Finally, the rebels were driven from the mountain, and the artillery threat to Melilla at last neutralized. The retaking of Mount Guragu ended the phase of operations in the vicinity of Melilla. With the highlands taken, the Spanish turned to the reoccupation of the plain of Guerrilla, to the west of the city and extending some way south. Ab-del Krim, unwilling to fight the now very numerous Spanish in terrain unsuitable for the kind of guerrilla tactics used by his forces, retreated before their renewed advance. The Spanish took Zalwan and the area nearby on the 14th, and finally the fortress of Monte Arut on the 24th. As the Spanish strongholds that had fallen in the wake of Anual were reoccupied, the Spanish were presented with the same spectacle of the unburied and mutilated corpses of the Spanish defenders that they had found at Nador, now mummified by almost 2 months of exposure to the hot and dry air of the Moroccan high summer. So now this would be a good place to pause and look a little closer at the adversaries that the Spanish were fighting here. In the last 2 episodes, we discussed briefly the nature of the people of the Rif and the Ab-del Krim family who would eventually lead them in rebellion against the foreign occupiers of their lands. But what kind of political and military machine had these brothers been putting together here? It was the elder brother, Muhammad, who was the head of the Riffian movement. In order to see better the kind of state system he aimed to set up, let's skip ahead in time a little and describe his regime in its better developed form, at the beginning of 1925, when he was arguably at the apex of his power. At this time, he had assumed the titles of head of state and prince of the Rif, and was formally addressed by his subjects as Sidna, or Lord. In practice, he had dictatorial power, exercised in the manner of contemporary Spanish and Latin American practice through a series of ministries, which were filled by Imgaran, or counselors, drawn from the United Tribes, selected by Ab-del Krim brothers personally. Ab-del Krim knew well, like many of the other leading figures in the story of this war, how to create a public image. The Riffians themselves seem to have regarded him as a man of learning and a brilliant ruler and war leader. Outside of the Rif, in the wider Islamic world of the time, almost all of which was under the thumb of one or another European power, he became a heroic figure and a symbol of resistance to foreign intrusion. The French, who were most immediately affected in their colonial interests by the rebellion in the Rif, regarded with alarm the appearance of portraits of the rebel leader in the homes and cafes of their nearby colonies, and even further afield in Egypt and Syria. However, Ab-del Krim's charisma held less of an element of charm for those actually under his rule, and while respected and feared, he was little loved in the Rif. This tended to increase as the novelty of his successful revolt faded, and as the war went on, a number of assassination attempts led him to keep his whereabouts secret. As a result, few in the lands under his control ever laid eyes on him, and he was transformed into a kind of legendary figure, to whom fearful powers and qualities were often attributed. The men in the cabinet of ministers noted above filled roles that would be analogous to their counterparts in Europe. For example, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, etc. Given the relatively undeveloped state of the Riffian territory and the nature of its social organization, these ministers presided over ministries that had little in common with those in more regimented, thoroughly organized states. In fact, these ministries were more or less embryonic, and intended more as window dressing to make more credible the Riffian claim to independent statehood. In fact, a great deal of the Riffian wartime organization seems to have been temporary, intended to be replaced with a more formal state system if and when independence was achieved, and recognition granted by one or more of the European powers. It was rumored and widely assumed that this future Republic of the Rif would be led by the younger brother, Mohammed. Mohammed was a much less public figure, though his was the key personality in the Rif after the elder Ab-del Krim. Under the wartime system, he wielded immense power and authority as commander-in-chief of the Riffian armies. As noted in the last episode, Mohammed was a brilliant scholar, and was completing his training in engineering in Madrid when called back to his family to help avenge the destruction of his father's house at the hands of the Spanish, and eventually to plot the overthrow of European hegemony in the Rif. His brilliance in the academy appears to have translated better than one would have expected to the conduct of a strenuous guerrilla campaign. After all, it must be remembered that the hard-studying scholar was also a true son of the Rif, who learned the use of the dagger and the gun practically in his cradle. As a tactical commander and a strategist, Mohammed would prove a master of the conduct of guerrilla warfare. European observers of the campaign in the Rif would consistently pay the brothers a backhanded compliment by insisting that their forces were in fact led by European officers and advisors. It must also be noted that Ab-del Krim's rule was based on the brutal suppression of the Riffian tribes, who were quick to resent the dominion of any leader. The alliance of the tribes was brought about by manipulations of the systems of the Lif alliance, and by prestige gained by the early victories. In the last resort, however, there proved to be no way to hold the Riffians together without drastic and terrible actions against those who acted against Ab-del Krim's interests. While murder of one's rivals was not an unusual way of resolving difficulties in traditional Moroccan society, a new element of terror was added by the Ab-del Krim regime, who frequently engaged in shocking and highly visible tortures and atrocities against those suspected of fomenting revolt and disunity, to instill fear in those who may contemplate similar moves in the future. This tendency towards cruelty grew as the war went on, and executions became increasingly commonplace. The arbitrariness with which these death sentences were handed out can be illustrated by one such incident, in which a Swiss mechanic and his assistant, who had signed on with the rebels, were ordered to repair a captured aircraft, which the Riffians wanted to use to bomb Melilla. Repairs proved impossible without replacement parts, and for this the two men were shot by order of the Prince of the Rif. The medieval nature of some of these punishments handed out by the Riffian leader include eyes burnt out with hot irons, all manner of mutilations, local tribal leaders soaked in gasoline and set on fire, and public stonings in marketplaces, a thing almost unknown among the Riffians up until this point and particularly disgusting to their sensibilities. As for the army that these men led, estimates vary considerably as to its size. Somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 seems to be a reasonable range for its peak strength, but many fewer than these would be available at any one time. Each tribe in the Rif furnished a certain number of men. The Beni Iriguel, the tribe of Ab-del Krim and the largest in the Rif, formed the core of the army, and its fighters had the best reputation for skill and tenacity. By far the largest part of these forces consisted of traditional harkas, or war bands, made up of fighting-age men drawn from the clans and families making up the tribes. These men usually served under their own leaders and fought in the vicinity of their homes. Generally, when a clash took place between Riffians and Spanish, the greater part of the Riffians involved would be drawn from the local population, though many exceptions existed, and fighters from other parts of the protectorate and from the French zone could also be found all throughout the region. These men were armed with a collection of rifles of varying age and origin, including many Spanish and French Mausers, Remingtons, Lebels, Grafs, St. Etienne's, some Buhafras taken from the Sultan's army, and many other types. Though most of these rifles were relatively modern, few were new and some were muzzle-loading relics of the musket age. They were also armed with knives and daggers, and often carried hand grenades, many of which were produced by dismantling captured Spanish 440-pound aerial bombs. The men of the Riffian Harka fought on foot, horses being very rare in the country, and carried all of their provisions with them. This normal mode of fighting was the stealth attack or the ambush. They were in general thoroughly familiar with the land, and very adept at the use of cover and concealment, and could move quickly and quietly in action. They were also possessed of very high endurance in comparison with their Spanish counterparts, and could march long distances and fight protracted battles with very little supply. This combination of qualities made them natural guerrilla fighters, and this mode of battle they would use in almost every occasion. Avoiding set-piece battles or open clashes between large bodies of troops, the Riffians would harass Spanish supply convoys, set up ambushes in which they would strike quickly at the surprised Spanish before melting away into the landscape. Pursuit was generally useless. Another favorite tactic was to cut off one of the many isolated outposts of the Spanish defensive system. Due to the inadequate supply storage in most of these posts, the move would reliably compel either a relief column or a breakout attempt. Relief forces would be ambushed, with a desperate garrison forced to flee into the face of the waiting Riffians. Actions such as these were fought over and over again. The use of these tactics maximized the advantages of the Riffians, while minimizing or negating the advantages in men, money, and equipment of the Spanish. The slowness of the Spanish to adapt to the kind of guerrilla war is somewhat puzzling. The term had, after all, become part of general usage as a result of the Spaniards' own use of these tactics against the French occupation of their country by Napoleon's lieutenants in the first decades of the last century. The guerrilla resistance of the early 1800s in fact formed the central part of the story of heroic resistance to foreign domination that grew out of the war against France. The Riffian forces were not, however, limited to the traditional Harkas and their kind of guerrilla warfare. The Ab-del Krims also created a small regular army on European lines as the hardcore of their forces. Not only would these regulars, as they were called, form the crack battlefield force of the Rif Republic, but it would provide a counterweight to the Harkas, who were primarily the forces of their individual tribes, as well as further enhancing the appearance of legitimacy of the Riffian state in the eyes of international observers. This force numbered no more than 7,000, with some putting the estimate at a much lower figure. These hand-picked men were mostly drawn from the Beni Iriguel tribe. Riffian officers were known as Cades or Cades Kabir, the latter rank being the higher. The largest divisions of the army were known as Mahallas. These were made up of tabors. These common Moroccan terms were also used by the Sultan's forces and the regulares in the Spanish service to denote formations of similar size. A Riffian tabor consisted of 3 or 4 smaller units known as mias. Each mia was made up of about 100 men, giving a tabor a strength of 300 to 500 men altogether. These subordinate formations were led by officers known as Cades el Mia or Cades el Tabor. The men of the Riffian army wore no uniform, but instead the traditional dress of the region. Branch and units were denoted by the color of the head covering worn. Rank was denoted by the number of cords on the head covering. Cades el Tabor wearing 3 red cords on their turbans, while Cades el Mia had 2. The training of the Riffians was under the supervision of one of their principal commanders, the Cade Buhut. This man had served with the Spanish regulares until his desertion to Ab-del Krim during the Anwar disaster, and was greatly respected as one who understood European methods of warfare and how to counter them. Specialist services in the Riffian army were often overseen by skilled foreigners. These were never more than a tiny fraction of Ab-del Krim's men, amounting to a handful of Spanish and French deserters and a few others drawn from all over Europe. One of these men, Otto Noya, was responsible for setting up and running the Riffian telephone communications network. Others held key positions in the Riffian artillery or medical services, but none exercised any influence outside of their area of expertise. The Riffian regular army was a force of infantry and artillery. The artillery was surprisingly formidable. At its peak, the Riffians would have more than 200 pieces. These were virtually all captured from the Spanish. Almost all of them were Schneider guns in either 65, 75, or 155 mm caliber. Riffian gunners, like their counterparts in the Spanish army, were an elite corps, and their standard of training was very high. Accuracy of their fire was a serious hazard, both to troops on the land battlefield and to ships operating off the Riffian coast. It was said that Ab-del Krim had in total only a couple dozen horses, and that these were used to dispatch messengers. A few armored cars and normal automobiles and trucks were captured or purchased abroad by the Riffians, but these were never used in any major support or battlefield role. A small coastal navy existed, though this consisted of boats rather than ships, and was limited to operations in the immediate vicinity of Alhucemas Bay. 3 aircraft were purchased from France in 1926, and were flown into the Rif by French pilots from Algeria. If these were used, they seem to have made no great impact, but did serve to increase the credibility of the Rif Republic in foreign eyes. Ammunition and supplies were stored at various points around the territory, usually in caves or some other natural hiding spot. The problem of supply was the major obstacle to Riffian success. However, for most of the conflict, this problem was more potential than real. The Spanish Navy blockade preventing smuggling was very porous, and foreign arms dealers found little trouble getting their cargoes ashore. The major source of munitions was nearby Tangier. Here, weapons and ammunition were sold openly in the markets, and Riffians or their agents would buy here and then send the guns, cartridges, and shells to the Rif overland, which the Spanish were totally unable to stop. The institution of a Spanish line of fortifications along the border with Tangier would later hinder this traffic somewhat, and the internationalization of the city in 1925 would provide some more deterrence to smuggling. The fact remained, however, that the Riffians had little trouble in procuring arms from this source throughout the conflict. The Riffians aimed to liberate their lands from foreign domination. The obstacles to the achievement of this end were not limited to the Spanish power in the protectorate. The French, an adversary many times more powerful than the Spanish, held in their Moroccan protectorate many of the lands of the Rif. As in many parts of the world in which Europeans established their colonial administrations, the lines between them were drawn without regard for facts of life on the ground. As a result, very often tribes, nations, or even families were divided by lines drawn across their lands by the decisions of diplomats meeting over maps in Berlin or Paris. This problem would bedevil many regions of the world following decolonization, and threatened to involve Ab-del Krim's nationalists in a much more dangerous struggle eventually, if their aim was to be achieved. Meanwhile, in the western commandancia, fighting had not come to a halt due to the withdrawal of the troops to meet the emergency in the east. It will be recalled that all 3 banderas had been concentrated here. 2 were directly involved in the campaign against Raizuli's stronghold at Tazaret. The other was based nearby at Dar Aqaba in support of this offensive. When news of the disaster reached Berenguer, 2 of these banderas were rapidly withdrawn and sent to the danger zone, along with many other Spanish units. When these had departed, the campaign in the west was effectively suspended, and the last bandera in the west withdrew into its encampment. Although major operations were suspended, small-scale fighting and supply convoy missions went on, and in the next 2 months hundreds were killed in numerous small actions. Major fighting took place in the border region of the 2 commandancias in late October. It involved the newly raised 4th Bandera, going into action for the first time, against the elite Beni Iriguel Harkas of Ab-del Krim's forces, operating in the Gamara. This raid so far west was unusual for the Riffians, and was led in person by Mohammed Ab-del Krim. On the 23rd, the 4th Bandera, which was based at Udlao on the coast, was tasked with escort of a supply run to the Spanish position at Caceres and to break the siege of Monte Magan, which was encircled by the cream of Ab-del Krim's men. An 8-hour battle ensued in which 22 legionaries were killed and another 80 wounded. The Spanish posts were supplied and the Riffians driven off, but, As was typical of Spanish tactics in this conflict, the column soon withdrew, and the Riffians soon came back and had Monte Magan invested again. 5 days later, the same bandera led a column under General Marsos from Wadlau to another attempt to relieve the post. The column set up an artillery position of Ashazar not far off, and with fire support from here, the soldiers inside the besieged post mounted a breakout attempt. At the same time, the 4th Bandera launched an attack from the outside. The combined assaults proved to be too much for the Riffians, who were compelled to flee and left the Gamara altogether. After this action, Ab-del Krim's men would not be seen this far west until a later stage of the conflict. This victory had been won at a very high price. The 4th Bandera, which had been formed less than a month before, had taken 285 casualties in these 2 actions, amounting to roughly half the force. As November 1921 began, the Tercio was split evenly between the 2 commandancias. 1st and 2nd were in the east in the Melilla sector, specifically at Sagangan, while the 3rd and 4th remained in the west at Dar Aqaba and Udlau, respectively. The 5th Bandera became operational this month, under the command of Major Juan Jose Perez. As in the case of the 4th, the new formation was made up of men drawn from the operational units in the depot companies, and new recruitment was used to fill gaps left by their reassignment. November saw a resumption of the Tercio's activity in the Melilla area. On the 7th, a column led by Major Sanjurio moved against the southern slopes of Mount Guragu. They marched on a village called Seb Tazarut, but withdrew into the fortifications at Nador after a week. Little was achieved by this foray, which by moving in a threatening direction was intended to distract Ab-del Krim's attention from another Spanish movement to occupy the territory west of Melilla. It was to the south of the city, however, in the territory of the Beni Buifar tribe, that the Tercio would fight its next major action. The objective was Mount Usan, specifically the fortifications atop this natural feature. These were guarded by steep cliffs. Franco decided to try and take the formidable position by surprise. In the pre-dawn hours of the 18th, the legionaries set off on a stealthy approach march, being ordered not to smoke or talk along the way, and with their pack animals left behind. They were accompanied by units of the armed police force of the Moroccan Sultan, the Melilla. In pre-dawn silence, the men scaled the sides of the ravine. At dawn, the signal was given to attack. The Tercio and the Melilla achieved total surprise over the Riffians, who were camped outside the works, and a frantic foot race began as the Spanish and their allies sprinted for the fortress of San Enrique in a bid to occupy it before the Riffians could get there themselves. They succeeded in taking the nearly empty fortress and shutting themselves up in it, and holding it against the enraged Riffians, who spent the rest of the day trying to take it back. Eventually they withdrew, leaving Franco's men in possession. The coup had been pulled off at a remarkably low cost, with the Spanish suffering only 9 men wounded and no fatalities. For the remainder of the month, Tercio continued to operate in the vicinity of the mountain, bringing about the resubjection of the Beni Buifar tribe. In these actions, the Riffians would typically retreat before the oncoming legionaries, then harass the columns or encampments of the Spanish after sunset. On the 30th, the legionaries were joined by the artillery instruction group, which was armed with heavy 155mm pieces. By the 1st of December, the Spanish had forced the submission of the inhabitants of the region, often by means of massacres and burnings of crops and villages. This campaign not only brought about the submission of the Beni Buifar, but the effective pacification of the plains to the south, and enabled the Spanish in the east to approach the valley of the Kurt River from the east. Meanwhile, major moves had begun again in the west. A column, which included the 2 banderas stationed there as well as the new 5th, along with the 3rd tabor of the Regulares de Ceuta, marched on the town of Ayalia and took it in a pitched battle. The units of the Tercio were led in this action by Milan Estrella, who had returned to the battlefield despite his chest wound having not fully healed. This column pushed on, and on the 21st took the old fortifications on the plateau of Raspadua with the help of artillery and aircraft. As the year closed, the Spanish in the east and west were converging on the valley of the Kurt River. Final operations of 1921 took place on December 22nd, when the 1st and 2nd Banderas participated in an assault on Ras Tigerman, a village situated on the banks of this river. This assault was pressed home with the loss of 8 killed and 41 wounded. As the new year began, a number of Spanish soldiers, most of whom were conscripts, that had arrived in the Protectorate swelled to more than 150,000. Berenguer, High Commissioner, was determined to use these new soldiers to hold the major Spanish towns at Melilla, Tetuan, Ceuta, and La Roche, due to their low reliability in open combat with the Riffians. This meant that the burden of offensive operations and other combat duties in the field would fall mainly on the units of the Tercio and the Regulares. The new government at home, led by the conservative Antonio Amara, would have been content to hold on to the coastal cities alone. Outside of the army, The war to secure the Moroccan territory had never been a very popular cause outside of a narrow circle of nationalists. Many within the army itself viewed the troublesome possession as more trouble than it was worth, a view that was widely shared among the population at large. Since 1909, the indifference to the Moroccan enterprise had been transformed into intense opposition by the deployment of large numbers of Spanish conscript soldiers there, and the consequent heavy toll in the lives of young Spanish draftees that the seemingly fruitless effort exacted. The issue had become one of the most divisive in contemporary Spanish politics. Berenguer and La Cierva, the Minister of War, however, were determined to continue the campaign against the rebels. In order for the Spanish to have peace in Morocco, even if they were to withdraw to their historic presidios, their enemies would have to be brought to heel. The course taken was to pursue Berenguer's plan of campaign while downplaying the Moroccan effort at home. This, in the context of continued conscription, was a plan with a very limited shelf life, and was bound to lead to another crisis if the fighting became protracted. In very broad terms, they intended to deal with their two enemies one at a time. First, they would concentrate against and crush Riffian, while remaining mainly on the defensive in the Rif. Once the Eagles Junot was dealt with, their armies would turn on Ab-del Krim and carry out the subjugation and occupation of the Rif. The operations against Riffian had three objectives. 1. To drive him from his stronghold at Tazaret. 2. To bring about the submission of the Precarious tribe, the center of resistance in the Jabala. And 3. To establish a fortified line from Wadlau on the coast to the Lucas River, near the boundary with the French zone, including the key town of Chauen. The operation was carried out in three phases, the first of which, the occupation of the area between Ceuta and Larache, was accomplished in the last days of December 1921. Phase 2 involved the establishment of fortifications on the northern bank of the Lucas, and Phase 3 would be the attack on Tazaret. The second phase of this program was achieved on the 6th of January when a column under the command of General Marcis, including the 3rd and 5th Banderas, reached the River Lucas. The men of the Tercio, led by the still recuperating Milan Astray, seized positions on the banks of that river at Juana Benibora. A few days later, the three Banderas in the west were operating against enemy positions in the vicinity of a place known as Drah el Asaf. After these attacks, the Spanish force, under General Castro Llorona, withdrew. The 5th Bandera, with Milan Astray, were posted in a rear flank guard position. On the route, they were set upon by a large body of rebel fighters, which outnumbered the Spanish by a significant margin. In company with the Regulares de Ceuta, the new Bandera successfully covered the retreat of most of the column. The stiff fight cost them 27 killed and 29 wounded, including Milan Astray, who added a serious wound in the right leg to his still unhealed chest wound he had already suffered in the fighting around Nador the previous autumn. In the Rif, meanwhile, the 1st and 2nd Banderas under Franco took part in a move on the important position of Dar Drias. This lay to the south and west of the Tercio's current positions, down the River Kurt, and inland from the territories of the Beni Said and Beni Ulichek tribes. As part of a column led by the High Commissioner himself, this column took the initial objective of Dar Pasuda on the 9th with little bloodshed. The next day, the Tercio stormed Dar Drias and secured it. In this attack, the legionaries were supported by a force of armored cars and protected trucks, as well as cavalry under the command of General Cabanellas, which were instrumental in putting the defenders to flight. Several pieces of Riffian artillery were abandoned and taken, or rather retaken, by the Spaniards, who put the place into a state of defense and readied it for long-term occupation. In the coming years, Dar Drias would become one of the principal bases of the Tercio. Unusually, no counterattack followed, and the Spanish were left in undisputed possession of this fort. The rest of January and February were generally quiet for the Legion. Bad weather throughout the Protectorate in these months limited operations on both sides. The Legion's activities were largely limited to routine convoy escort duty. The only significant battle fought in this period came at the very end of February, when a late-night attack on Dar Drias was repelled by legionaries roused from sleep, fighting the enemy in their underwear. Improving weather in March led to a resumption of operations. These were directed against the Beni Said and Beni Ulichek tribes, the territory of which lay to the west of the current Spanish positions, and extended between the Mediterranean coast and the Kurt River to the south. The offensives in this area were intended to rectify the Spanish line north of the Kurt Valley. March also brought the first tanks to arrive in Spanish Morocco. These were 9 French-built Renault FT-17 models. These, like all the FT-17s and their derivatives employed by the Spanish, were armed with machine guns only, in this case Hotchkiss designs chambered for the standard 7mm round used by most of their rifles and machine guns. These arrived early in the month, and 2 more followed shortly afterwards, one of these a command variant. The tanks were organized into 2 sections of 5, not counting the command tank, and would be posted near the recently taken base at Dardrius. Spanish began their new effort in the area on the 7th, when a column, including the 1st and 2nd Banderas under the battered Milan Estrella, departed this forward base and established a position at Zoya de Aloda, some 3 kilometers to the west. This was accomplished, and the next day the Spanish turned to the northeast, moved on towards the village of Sepsa, which was taken at a cost of 3 killed and 7 wounded. On the 14th, this column had crossed the river Ardana, a tributary of the Kurt, and reached the Arkab Plateau, where they built a series of outposts and then withdrew to Dardrius. A few days later, these same banderas would take part in the first armored attack in Spanish army history. This went forward on the 18th. The FT-17s were given the task of taking Ambor, a strong position situated atop the plateau. The 2 banderas accompanied the machines, the first under the command of Franco and the second led by Major Carlos Rodriguez Fontanes. The Tercio went into action against Harkas of the Beni Said and Beni Ulachek who opposed them, and advanced under the cover of the tank's machine guns. The ground over which the Spanish had to advance was rough and broken, and progress was slow. Easier going was eventually reached, and this proved to be the tank's undoing. As the assault went in, the tanks ran out ahead of the legionaries, and found themselves unsupported and surrounded by Riffians. Without infantry to keep them off, the Riffians rushed the relatively clumsy tanks, some of which developed difficulties with their armament or engines. The inexperienced tankers were unable to fend off the multitude of attackers coming in from all sides, and their thinly armored machines were pelted with small arms fire and rocks, with some of their attackers even climbing on top of the tanks and stabbing at the crews with daggers through the vision slits. At least one tanker was badly wounded in this way. More or less helpless against this sudden attack, the tanks eventually exhausted their ammunition or were immobilized. The latter were abandoned by their crews, who made a desperate dash back towards the line of the legionaries. The derelict machines would later be blown up by the Riffians with explosives captured from a Spanish mine overrun the previous fall. Despite the debacle of the armor, the Legion would press on and take Ambor later that day. It would be fortified and armed with a battery of mountain guns, serving for a while as the chief outpost of the Tercio in the region. Casualties included 11 killed, including Fontanes, commander of the 2nd Bandera. Another 65 were wounded. The 2 banderas remained at Ambor until the 29th of March. On that day, they formed the vanguard of a strong column made up of themselves, Cabanella's cavalry, and units of the Regulares and the Melilla. This force moved on the town of Tuguns to the north of Dardrius, and having taken that, moved on to nearby Kala. Having taken these immediate objectives, the column advanced in the direction of the Bas River. On the way, they were ambushed in difficult terrain by Riffians with artillery hidden among steep-sided ravines. The fire fell hardest on the cavalry and the Regulares, but under cover of the Tercio, the rest of the column was able to break off the action and extricate itself from the perilous situation and withdraw. As the legionaries were beginning these operations after Ambor, the Spanish suffered a setback at sea when Riffian artillery repeatedly hit and sank the 925-ton mail steamer Juan de Juanes off the shore of Alhucemas Bay. The ship and her cargo were a total loss, and the incident cast doubt on the practicability of an amphibious landing at that point on the coast. Seaborne invasion at this point, very near the Riffian capital of Ashtir, was being postulated as the best means for bringing this costly struggle to an end quickly. The loss of this ship meant that the Riffians were likely to meet any attempt here with dangerous force. This action, along with the failure of the tanks the day before, ended Spanish hopes that the use of heavier weapons would overcome the Riffians. The weapons in the hands of the Riffians had proven themselves capable of repelling Spanish moves of this kind. These actions have been recounted in some detail to give an idea of the texture of the war that was developing in the Rif. The outlines of the struggle are clear enough from these actions. The result of the rising of the Riffians transformed the goals of the Spanish from holding the country to holding a chain of bases and forts. It was clear that she did not have the force to subdue the Rif outright, and the situation had developed into one of stalemate, where advances could be made and the system of occupation maintained, only at the cost of heavy losses in men. The typical action that was fought between the Spaniards and the Riffians here was a small action between lightly equipped riflemen, usually supported by a small number of machine guns. In most cases, the weapons used on both sides were virtually identical. Less often, artillery would be involved, again in small numbers and on both sides. Spanish would sometimes employ cavalry, but this was the exception rather than the rule. Rarely, the Spanish would employ aircraft or tanks, the latter being either FT-17s like the ones mentioned before or World War I era Schneider turretless models. These are present only in single-digit numbers and never played an important role in the campaign, although the Schneiders, which were armed with low-velocity 75mm guns, were sometimes put to good use as self-propelled assault guns. Armored cars and protected trucks were present in somewhat larger numbers. The latter were regular civilian trucks, with non-armor grade steel welded or bolted onto the chassis, sometimes fitted with a machine gun. These vehicles are not well suited to the Moroccan battlefield, which is filled with rugged terrain and had only a small number of improved, hard-surfaced roads. Given the very high ground pressure of the vehicles in this category available to the Spanish, they were useless off-road in most terrain, and good only for convoy duty in the better developed routes. Over and over again we read of a Spanish mission to supply a position, or establish an outpost, or break a siege, after which the column involved withdraws to base. Often the same post is the object of several such missions in successive days. This illustrates the main problem of the Spanish, and the chief cause of their stalemate in the Rif. Though they could drive the Riffians off, they could rarely bring them to a decisive battle. Given the inadequacy of their logistical situation, they were unable to sit inside their forts and wait to choose battle in advantageous circumstances. As a result, the Spanish were forced to fight dozens and dozens of costly small actions, often in situations which gave their foes a tremendous advantage. As many other imperial states would find in similar situations throughout the 20th and now the 21st century, there seemed to be no way to bring the fighting to a conclusion. In the middle of 1922, the Spanish had reached more or less the line that had been held by Silvestre at his furthest extension the year before. As noticed before, the Riffians had determined not to engage the Spanish with their main forces on the plains and low plateau of the land west of Melilla. Fighting detailed in the foregoing sections was almost entirely against the men of the local tribes and villages fighting in relatively small numbers. As a result, though the fighting along the way was vicious, the Spanish had encountered nothing that could actually stop their advance. By the end of May, they held a chain of forts running from the coast inland near the Moroccan River, in the area where the plain that stretches west from Melilla ends and the foothills of the mountains of the central Rif begin. The principal Spanish position in this line was Tisiata, just a few kilometers south of the site of Anwal. Despite the shattering experience of not even a year before, the Spanish had learned little about sighting their fortifications. The outpost was built in a situation just like that which doomed the post of Guerrilla, that is, atop a barren, waterless height approachable only through a narrow, steep-sided, and easily blocked ravine. When the Spanish cancelled their operations against Raizuli's fortress at Tazarat, wake of Anwal, it seemed that once again the Eagle of Janat's supernatural protection had availed him. As we have noted, on the very day of the planned final attack, the news reached the Spanish, who at once withdrew the bulk of their forces to Tetuan. The magnificent success of the Riffians inspired attacks among the inhabitants of the western commandancy as well. The worst of these troubles were in the Lucas River Valley, inland from the Atlantic coast. At the end of August, a Harka composed of tribesmen from the Al Sarif and Samada tribes launched a surprise assault on the Spanish garrison at Akbakola in the territory of the Beni Yasef tribe. They overwhelmed the Spanish conscripts here and left more than 200 dead. A relief column was dispatched from Alcazar Quivir to help the fort, but found only the burnt remains of it and its defenders. However, these disturbances passed, and despite the exhortations of Ab-del Krim's agents among the tribes of the western commandancia, the area remained relatively quiet during the critical weeks of 1921. This remained true even during the dangerous days of the Riffian intrusion into the Gamara mentioned before, when a crack Harka led by Mahmed in person mounted a raid in force on the legionary post at Wood Lao. As Spanish troops poured into the protectorate, the Spanish reoccupied their lost positions in the west as well. While not painless, the task was easier than in the east, as Raizuli's forces had been defeated before the withdrawal and had only a short time to recover. By early May, as the Spanish were establishing their line in the east, the fortress at Tazarat was finally taken in a combined assault carried out by the regulares de Ceuta and two banderas of the Tercio. Raizuli himself escaped capture and fled further into the mountains to the village of Buhashan. The Eagle of Janat, at bay at last, faced death or capture by the Spaniards or flight to Ab-del Krim. There was no love between the two rebels. Raizuli chose to take his chances with the Spaniards rather than to turn to this Berber upstart for help. Once again his supernatural protection seemed to come to his aid, this time in the form of domestic politics. A great deal of controversy had been aroused in Spain over the Anwal disaster and its consequences in the following months. Inquiries were held into the responsibilities for the disaster, and Berenguer, the High Commissioner, was a prominent target of these inquiries. He had offered his resignation in the wake of the disaster, but it had been rejected. Now, with news of further battles in the Protectorate reaching the public, many of whom had apparently been persuaded that the war in Morocco had ended after Anwal, the Spanish effort in the Protectorate was under intense scrutiny once more. Among other targets, the committee had focused once again on Berenguer, and he once again offered to resign. This time the offer was accepted, and probably the best leaders served in Spanish Morocco stepped down. The army's reputation had taken a real blow in the year following Anwal, one not helped by the additional political fight over the fate of the prisoners taken by the Riffians, and even now still held for ransom. Popular opinion was on the side of bringing these men and women home by any possible means. Many in the army, and the Africanista element almost entirely, were flatly opposed to the payment of any ransom. The consequences in terms of Spanish prestige and control in the protectorate, they argued, would be disastrous if Ab-del Krim received even a peseta from Madrid. The new government policy in the protectorate would be implemented by the new High Commissioner, General Ricardo Bergueta. The policy he was ordered to implement was one of settling the disputes in the territory financially rather than with force. As soon as he arrived at his post in Tetuan, he opened negotiations with a no doubt very surprised Raizzuli. These began in September, and once again the settlement worked out in Raizzuli's favor. In return for his token submission to the Sultan and the Spanish, he walked away with a huge subsidy, and with no obstacles placed in the way of the restoration of his power. He was even allowed to retain his stronghold at Tazarut, and to top it off, Spanish troops were soon at work building a new palace for him there. The Spanish also withdrew from many of their posts throughout the Jabala, without taking the precaution of disarming the tribes whose territory they were leaving. This policy bought peace in the West, but the consequences of the deal were obviously bad in the long run for the Spanish. With very little additional military effort, they could have eliminated one of their enemies for good. Instead, they not only spared him, but gave him the money and freedom needed to quickly rebuild his power, along with another tremendous boost to his prestige and influence. Once again, it seemed, destiny had plucked the eagle of Shinat from the traps of his enemies, and restored him to power, this time stronger than ever. Not long afterwards, the relative quiet in the east ended. By reaching the lines centered on Tiziazza, the Spanish had reached the approaches to the mountains of the central Rif. Fighting had erupted from time to time in this area since May. This was the line past which the Riffians had determined no Spanish penetration could be tolerated. The boulder-strewn slopes of the foothills rising from the plain were easily defended, and Spanish attempts to push past this line ran into resistance strong enough to turn them back. By November, the Riffians were ready to strike in force. A large Riffian force struck Tiziazza on the 1st of November. A 2-day battle resulted. Riffians attacked in much greater force than the Spanish had encountered since Anwal, and the fighting cost the Spanish more than 2,000 casualties. As a result of this sobering check, Bergueta called off further advances in the Rif. The Spanish dug in for a long stay and fortified their positions further. Another heavy Riffian attack came in December. This was more easily held. Meanwhile, fighting was taking place all along the Spanish defensive network. It appears the Riffians were preparing for a long war as well. Men of the Tercio operating out of their base at Dardrius reported finding regular trench systems appearing among the Riffian positions they were overrunning. The enemy revealed their comparative lack of knowledge in constructing these kinds of defenses, the legionaries noted, pointing out that the Riffians threw the soil backwards when digging the trenches, rather than forward where it could be piled into a defensive barrier. Bergueta revised his strategy in the light of the new offensive in the Rif. It appeared that the Spanish were too weak and too unstable at home to press the matter to a military conclusion. The Riffians were unwilling to treat with them, but also lacked the strength to evict the Spanish from the territory they controlled. So Bergueta decided on a strategy of blockade. He would seal the Rif off from the rest of the protectorate by land, and deploy the Spanish navy along the coast. The latter would bombard the coastal settlements of the Rif until Ab-del Krim agreed to release the Spanish prisoners. The Spanish assigned several heavy units, 11 Coast Guard vessels, a dirigible, and the seaplane carrier Daedalo to the blockade duty. The strategy of intimidation did not succeed in freeing the prisoners, and had only a limited effect on smuggling, and the ships involved frequently found themselves under fire from Riffian cannon hidden among caves and among the rocks on shore. Meanwhile, controversy broke out in the ranks of the divided Spanish army over the affair of the so-called Larache millions. In effect, this was a scheme by corrupt officers who stole more than 1 million pesetas worth of money and equipment meant for the forces at Larache. This issue reignited the ever-smoldering conflict in the Spanish army between the Juntero faction, who opposed promotions for merit, and the Africanistas. As the Juntero's career interests were only threatened by the war in the Protectorate, their faction overlapped increasingly with that of the Abandonistas, that is, those who advocated the total abandonment of the Moroccan territory. This conflict would have decisive consequences for the course of the war. Most immediately, the commander of the Tercio, Milan Astray, tendered his resignation over this controversy, in a very public way that bordered on insubordination. His resignation was accepted, and the controversial leader of the Legion returned to Spain. Meanwhile, pressure on the Spanish government to secure the release of the prisoners intensified, and negotiations through intermediaries eventually brought their release for the sum of 4 million pesetas. Prisoners were duly released and taken to Melilla in January 1923. Of the 570 taken prisoner, only 326 survived to be released. These numbered 44 officers, 239 soldiers, and 43 civilians, 33 of whom were women and children. All of the prisoners bore the marks of ill treatment and were sick and undernourished. Most of the sickness, however, seems to have been the result of a typhus epidemic which had struck their captors as well, and several of the prisoners were reported as saying that the Riffians had been fair captors, and that while the experience as prisoners had been hard, their lot seemed little different from that of the Riffians themselves. In the last days of 1922, the Spanish government determined that a civilian high commissioner would serve their interests best in Morocco. As a result, Bergueta was let go, and Don Miguel Villanueva installed in his place. This man was a poor choice, as he was so ill that he was never able to assume office. The government then appointed Luis Silvela, took over in February 1923. At the same time, Ab-del Krim was consolidating his power in the Central Rif, and had himself proclaimed Emir, or Prince of the Rif, at the beginning of that month. Now, with his power apparently stable, he could begin his bid for international legitimacy in earnest. The situation would remain relatively stable until June, when another major assault would be launched by the Riffians against Tiziazza. The Spanish were determined not to give up a foot of their hard-won territory, while Ab-del Krim hoped to set off on another annual and rid the Rif of the Spanish altogether. A fierce battle raged back and forth, with the Spanish in severe danger at several points. The situation was once again saved by the Tercio, whose new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Valenzuela, led a bayonet charge against a critical portion of the Riffian attacking force. His men rose to follow him, and drove the Riffians back off the slopes even as Valenzuela himself was struck dead. In his stead, Franco was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the Tercio, another key step in his rise to power. After this battle, Ab-del Krim offered negotiations to the Spanish, in the hopes that the stalemate would convince them of the futility of hoping for victory, and that they might take this chance to exit the Moroccan quagmire. Representatives of each side met on board a ship in Alhucemas Bay, but the negotiations came to nothing. The Spanish government, in consequence, demanded that the Africanista faction of the army draw up a workable plan for victory. This they did that summer, and produced a plan that envisioned further fortification of the Spanish line about Tiziazza, now dubbed the Silvestre Line, and a second line to be created behind this one, with mobile forces stationed in between. The system of defense in depth was being considered on August 22, 1923, when another major attack was launched by the Riffians against the Spanish line. This targeted a large supply convoy en route to Tiziazza. At Tifaruin, very near the site of the Annual battle, a force of more than 9,000 Riffians attacked this convoy. Desperate fighting by the Spanish escort drove off the attack, inflicting more than 600 casualties on the attackers. On the same day, the political situation in Spain boiled over. Mutinies broke out in Barcelona and Malaga among draftees bound for Morocco. Riots broke out in both cities, but were subdued by a show of force on the part of loyal army officers. The leader of the mutiny in Malaga, Corporal Sanchez Barroso, was arrested by military police and given the death penalty. However, the Madrid government, responding to popular outcry, stepped in and annulled the man's sentence. As army and government squared off against one another, the whole country hovered on the brink of revolt, and the Moroccan question was uppermost in every mind. As the country prepared to tear itself apart, a man who had dominated the destiny of Spain for the next half-decade appeared and stepped in to take the reins. This was Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of Barcelona and one of the Army's most popular and influential officers. Almost effortlessly, Primo de Rivera pulled off a bloodless coup d'etat, and in the name of the king took control of the government of Spain, discarding the now almost completely non-functional constitutional system. Under this man's leadership, Spain would attempt to extricate itself from the bear trap of its Moroccan commitments. And that's where I'm going to end this episode. Hope you found some of this interesting or useful. Next time we talk about the Rif War, we'll see who this new dictator of Spain was, and what he intended to do to save the situation both in the protectorate and in the mother country. Next time, however, we'll return to the career of the SPD Dauntless dive bomber, and take a look at its entry into service the year before direct American involvement in the Second World War, and the vital role this untested plane was to play in the most crucial carrier battles in the first year of the war against Japan. So I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, as always, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.